Good afternoon, folks. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. I appreciate the invite was sent out quite short notice. Just to understand why we did that, we wanted to host this as soon as we could before the consultation that we're going to go through closes on the 18th of September. So this consultation represents the biggest area of reform, certainly at the minute, if not certainly in my 15 years within the industry, other than maybe the introduction of the common charging methodologies. And with it being the biggest area of reform, it represents the biggest area of uncertainty. So this is a consultation looking at the reform of access and forward-looking charging arrangements. So, by way of introductions, I'm Lee Wells, Network Revenue Policy Manager at Northern Powergrid. My role covers mainly the calculation, but also the recovery of our allowed revenue. Key parts being compliance with licence and code obligations. I'm quite heavily involved with the targeted charging review, another one of Ofgem's initiatives, and some supplier of last resort issues at present. So today I'm mainly going to set the scene and leave the real detail to my colleague. So conscious it's lunchtime, and I do apologise, and Andrew may not be happy with me for doing this, but I'm going to refer back to an analogy we use on user system charges of cake. So if you think about cake, my role is really about how big that cake is, how much revenue is to be recovered. So I'm hoping Andrew's going to continue this theme, which he doesn't look very happy about, as he introduces himself.
Okay, thanks Lee. Good afternoon everyone. So I'm Andrew Ensor. I'm Charges Policy Manager at Northern Powergrid. I'm a few short of Lee's 15 years in the industry, but as Lee's mentioned, this is one of the most interesting periods of change that we've been through in recent years. I'm afraid I will continue the cake analogy. So if Lee's role is to determine the size of the cake, my role is involved in determining how big each slice of the cake is, that being how much we recover from different user segments. My role ranges from the kind of day-to-day incremental improvements to the charging policies we're using at the moment. So the way in which we're going to shortly calculate our next set of charges, right through to the wider reviews like this and the targeted charging review that Lee's already mentioned. So I think I'll hand back over to Lee, who's going to set the scene a bit, and then I'll be talking about the detail of this consultation a little later on.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. So in terms of format, we'll talk for around 30 minutes. Just to get housekeeping stuff, you guys will be on listen-only mode, but please take part in the live polls. We've got a few coming up. Please submit any questions using the question bar. We're going to look down to these at the end of the webinar. If there's any which you would rather we didn't answer, we might have to judge that, and we'll look to respond via email, and we're going to look to do that straight after this webinar closes. So the webinar is going to close no later than 1 p.m, but we will have a decent chunk for questions in there, hopefully. If you've got any feedback, or if you want to submit any questions, please do so to our user system charges mailbox. So that's uos.charges@northernpowergrid.com. Alternatively, please send them on to Andrew and myself. Our email address has been our names@northernpowergrid.com. So we really would like some feedback. So we'd like to know whether this webinar has been helpful and hear your views as to how we should be engaging further. And just to note, this webinar is going to be recorded and will be later made available certainly by our Northern Powergrid YouTube channel. So what we'd really like to get from this webinar is to provide an overview of the access and forward-looking charges consultation. We're going to briefly cover the current arrangements and what the perceived issues are that the reform will be seeking to address. We're going to look to share our position on some key areas of the consultation. So the consultation itself provides context as to what's being reviewed, seeks views on the scope, and also how the reform will be delivered, so the mechanism, the significant code review basically. But we're also going to look to provide you some insights as to what we think reform could actually look like. And finally, as I've said, we'd really like to hear your views. You've got an opportunity to ask questions, as mentioned, but please also feel free to send in questions post or during this webinar to the user system mailbox. We'd like to engage on a bilateral basis to go into further detail. So if there's something you're interested in, then again, please get in touch. We're going to use your views to shape our consultation response, but equally we're keen to engage after the consultation. So the consultation I've mentioned, seeking views on scope and delivery. So there's plenty of time after this the 18th of September to influence what's a significant piece of work going forward. So we're going to be heavily involved regardless of the delivery mechanism. We'll explain this further later on. So we really do want to take on board your views and discuss them further. This button works. So we'll kick off the first poll. I'll make it live in a minute. So what we're asking, to get a feel for how familiar you are with this area of work, we're asking what your current level of understanding is of the access and forward-looking charges reform. So 4 possible answers there: I don't understand it at all, limited understanding, reasonable working understanding, or I'm an expert. I'll make the poll live now. Right, I think you've got a minute or so, so please let us know what your current level of understanding is. I can see them responses coming in now. Give it a little bit longer. Just say as well, we're going to ask this question later on to see if anything we've said has helped improve your understanding. Hopefully we've avoided confusing you even more. But we're going to do this after we've given you an opportunity to ask some questions, just in case we haven't covered anything which you've got any specific questions about, because this is a very broad and very complicated subject. Just give it a little bit longer. Right, I shall end the poll there. So we've got some who don't understand it at all, thankfully in the minority. Most have limited understanding, and then we have a few with reasonable working understanding. We don't have any experts, which quite frankly I'm not surprised at, so it gives us a good basis for what we're looking to hopefully send some messages out and move those with limited understanding up to reasonable, and hopefully not have anyone with don't understand it at all. We shall try our best. So let's just take a quick look at the current arrangements before we start looking at identifying any problems and then any possible reform to solve these. So distribution usage system charges then. Recovered, the revenue is almost entirely recovered from demand users. Consistent with transmission, we charge you for connecting to our network. The key difference between connecting at transmission and distribution is something which will be drawn up by Andrew shortly. So in terms of use of system charges, there's 2 components. You've got the forward-looking charges. Now included in here is a fixed charge. That's standard charges and capacity charges, which are levied on a daily basis. And then you've got time of use or locational charges depending on the voltage of connection. So you've got 2 methodologies in distribution. The common charge and distribution methodology, the CDCM, which derives average time of use charges for the low and high voltage customers. And then you've got the extra high voltage distribution charging methodology, the ADCM, deriving site-specific locational charges for our designated EHV customers. And then there's a second component, which is the residual or scaling, and I'm doing air quotes as I say these words, which you can't see. So this component is not covered in the consultation. It's instead the focus of Ofgem's target charger review, significant code review, so the TCR. We don't intend to go into detail on the TCR as part of this slide set. We're happy to discuss this further. It's another big piece of work. Thankfully not as complicated as the forward-look charges and access consultation though. And alternatively, if you want to look online, there's a Charging Futures website which has got some excellent material for both the access and forward-looking charges and the TCR. Some really good webinars and podcasts recorded on there as well. So in terms of transmission, on the face of it, very similar arrangements. Key differential really being on the use of system charges, the locational element, and in terms of when the revenue is recovered, so I'm thinking of triads specifically here. As mentioned, connection charges, these are levied on almost usually directly on the developers. Use of system charges, we levy them on suppliers so that in terms of the signals we send, they're not necessarily passed straight through to the end user. I mentioned that the fixed charge includes a capacity element as well. In terms of drivers for change, I think key thing I would want to mention here is flexibility is the key term. So it's basically users generating and consuming at different times. It's coming from different sources at both generation and demand. So for generation, you think storage is a relatively new concept, very hot topic at the minute. And then demand, you've got electric vehicles, which has got the scope to present a significant challenge for the industry. In addition, users want to be able to trade bilaterally with each other, which isn't something the current arrangements necessarily facilitate. So the last slide before I hand over to Andrew, I just want to kind of give a feel for the areas of reform, whether they're progressing or just where it's being looked at. So in no particular order of the segments as you see them on the screen, you've got the DCUSA being the Distribution Connection and User System Agreement, dealing with standard code modifications which are raised by the Open Governance Arrangements. There's still some fundamental changes raised via this route. Just a point worth noting that these changes, unless otherwise approved by Ofgem, aren't covered by anything currently under scope of a significant code review, the only one at present being the TCR. We've then got the Electricity Networks Association, the ENA, Open Networks Project. This is primarily looking at the transition to a distribution system operator, a DSO, and asking the fundamental question of exactly understanding what is a DSO. We've covered the TCR briefly, so I'm not going to go into that. Charging futures, so this is what we're primarily concerned about today. So to provide a brief bit of history, Charging Futures launched in November 2017. It encompasses the Charging Futures Forum, the CFF, which comprises a wide range of stakeholders throughout the industry and provides a means for all to access the information. And if I was to coin kind of the motto of the CFF, provides a means for stakeholders to learn, ask and contribute. Also includes the Charging Delivery Body, the CDB. So this primarily serves to communicate, coordinate and deliver reform. And last but certainly not least, you've got the task forces. So there was two established to look at access and forward-looking charging arrangements. The two basically ultimately acted as one group, and primarily via a subgroup of the NA Open Networks project, with 4 being the charging workstream, published a joint final report recommending to Ofgem areas of reform. And ultimately, that's the basis of what this consultation is. So I'm going to hand over to Andrew now, who was very heavily involved in that work.
Okay, thanks, Lee. So just before we dive into some of the detail of this consultation, I'm just going to talk a bit about the big picture, really, of what Ofgem are trying to achieve in launching this consultation and continuing with this work, as Lee mentioned, that has been running for the past year or so by the task forces and the CFF. So we're just going to talk through the desirable features which Ofgem has identified for future arrangements. So these are sort of blank canvas type desirable features where if we were unconstrained by existing arrangements, what might we look for? So just going to talk through each of these in turn. So starting with the first one, network capacity allocated in accordance with users' needs. So often this will mean capacity is allocated to those who value it most. For example, we mentioned on the drivers for change with increasing generation constraints on distribution networks. We might be able to meet this objective through some kind of market mechanisms to allocate the capacity that's available on the network, with the kind of caveat that we need to take care there with the risk of kind of socially regressive outcomes from market mechanisms, particularly if we talk about smaller users. Moving on to cost-reflective charges then. So the second objective being that network users face cost-reflective charges for their network access and usage. So this is about ensuring that the charges a user incurs, or perhaps the payments that a user benefits from, reflect the incremental cost, or in the latter example, benefit that user's usage of the network drives for the network company. Again, we need to take care there that charges that are extremely cost-reflective can be potentially volatile, unpredictable, and again, risk being socially regressive, particularly for example, vulnerable customers who don't have the flexibility to move around their demand to different times of the day, for example. The third desirable feature, that arrangements provide a level playing field. So this is really all about arrangements being technology neutral. So an increment of demand in a given location at a given time should be charged the same, regardless of what that demand is used for. The fourth desirable feature then that forward-looking charges are simple, transparent and predictable. So we really want these charges to drive some changes in user behaviour, and that's only going to happen if a user is confident enough that they can make decisions about their behaviour with some knowledge of the charges that they will face as a result. If the charges are too unpredictable or too complicated, that's unlikely to happen. Appropriate allocation of risk. So this is all about risk being allocated to the party that's best placed to manage that risk. This is quite often the network operator. We're quite well placed to manage risk on our networks in terms of user behaviours, simply because we have a large body of users and can rely on a certain amount of diversity between those users. But there may be times when actually that risk is better allocated to for example, new connectees. So we may ask that a new connectee commits to paying charges for a predefined period of time after their connection, regardless of whether they use it or not. Supporting efficient network investment then, the penultimate desirable feature on this list. So this is about network companies being able to determine with some confidence where new network capacity is needed. So for example, if charges are particularly high in a given network location, but users continue to use the network in that location, continue to want to connect there, that's a good indicator to the network operator that additional network capacity in that area is likely to be well used. And then finally, arrangements reflecting that electricity is an essential service. So this is really about protecting the needs of vulnerable customers who, as I say, may not be in a position to participate in flexibility markets and the like, and perhaps protecting smaller users from the potential volatility and exposure to market mechanisms. Finally, on this slide, we've got Ofgem acknowledging that changes need to be practical and proportionate. So we're really saying that the benefits of the implementation of any change needs to outweigh the associated costs of implementation. So moving on. So prior to publishing this consultation, Ofgem commissioned the consultancy firm Beringa to look at issues with the current arrangements and to assess the materiality of those issues. So Beringa identified 22 issues, grouped into 6 categories, which you can see those categories on this slide. I'm not going to go through those in detail, but really the bottom half of this slide is where the focus of this consultation lies. So there's three areas that have really been highlighted as the key drivers and the high priority areas for this work. So the first of them, enabling demand growth. So this is really about the move to low carbon technologies, for example, electric vehicles, electric heat pumps, where we could potentially see significant increases in demand on distribution networks. For example, one can imagine a cluster of electric vehicles would drive the need for network upgrades. The counter to that is if we can manage that increase in demand smartly and incentivize it to use the network at times away from peak, we could avoid that network reinforcement and connect additional demand without the need for costly network upgrades. The second high priority area, managing constraints that have come about as a result of generation connected to distribution networks. So over recent years, we've seen some areas of the distribution networks become generation dominated, where historically we've always had demand dominated networks. So in some areas, this means that there is now no space for new generation to connect. The network is effectively full in those locations, and the current arrangements give limited options to generators who want to connect in those areas. So part of this work is looking to expand the options that generators have in that situation. And then finally, the interface between transmission and distribution networks. So as I mentioned previously, historically, the distribution networks have been demand dominated, and there's been an assumption that energy flows from the transmission network onto the distribution network and down to demand from end users. And that assumption is now breaking down. The amount of generation on distribution networks means that there are some instances where distribution networks are in fact sending energy back onto the transmission network. So the need to ensure that charges reflect the impact user behaviours have on the whole system, so not just to the network they're connected to, but also to, in the case of distribution connected users, the impact their behaviour has on the transmission network. So moving on, then we're going to get stuck into the detail. So this consultation focuses on 6 areas, which I'm going to talk through in turn. So starting off with access rights for smaller users. So you'll have to forgive me for being somewhat vague on what a smaller user is. Ofgem is also a little vague. We're generally considering this to be residential users and micro businesses, so the very smallest end. So the status quo for these customers is that their network access rights are not closely defined. So they can essentially use up to the level of their connection assets, so that the size of the fuse, whenever they wish. So their access right is not defined in that way. So there's a risk there that users connecting new demands can use them at peak time without being exposed to the costs that peak time use drives on the network. So there's potential new approaches, potentially requiring users to specify how much access they require, or perhaps an intermediary working on their behalf to specify that access, and then the potential to set a core capacity which all users would be entitled to, with the potential then to obtain additional capacity beyond that through other products. Moving on to access rights for larger users then. So the status quo here is that network access rights are loosely defined, in that these larger users generally have connection agreements that define a maximum capacity. The majority of users can use up to that agreed maximum capacity at any time, and those arrangements go on indefinitely. So Ofgem considered that greater choice could enable better use of the existing capacity on the network. So there's 3 areas that are up on this slide that are being considered. So firmness, being the level of certainty that a user has of being able to use the network, and also the consequences of the network not being available. So for example, they might receive some payment for the network being unavailable. Time profiling, so the potential for off-peak access or for seasonal access rather than the current connection agreements, which are essentially all day, every day. And then finally, depth. So this is a kind of concept where users who balance demand and generation locally may not need access to the wider network, and so could have local-only access. Moving on to the allocation of access rights, then my diagram gets a bit tricky at this point because I'm trying to show things that aren't there, hence the red dashed box. So starting with things that are there. In terms of initial allocation of access rights, the primary focus of this work is on queue management. So where there is a connection queue, better identifying the users in that queue who genuinely want to connect and who are genuinely ready to connect over those who are perhaps more speculative in nature. That can potentially be done through things like milestones on the progress of the connection as well. And then in terms of reallocation of access, there's potential for kind of use it or lose it clauses and conditions for network access. This no C&M that's appeared on this slide, so there's a mechanism called connect and manage, which is used on the transmission network. So new users are connected as what's known as financially firm. So if they're curtailed, their network access is curtailed, they receive a payment to compensate for that. Ofgem is not considering extending that arrangement to distribution, which has been discussed for some time. Comprehensive review of GEOS charges then. So this covers 3 areas. The granularity of charging at HV and LV. So as Lee mentioned previously, users connected at those voltages face average charges. Ofgem's proposing that those users could face charges which vary depending on the state of the network where they're connected. Changes to the EDCM, so that again, the EDCM is the methodology that Lee mentioned for EHV, extra high voltage users. So as things stand, users connected to distribution networks at EHV are charged on a site-specific basis, so they have a tariff per site. There is a potential in this consultation that's suggested of aligning the mechanism by which those locational charges are derived with the mechanism used for transmission connectees. And then tariff design. So under the existing tariffs, around 80% of distribution revenues recovered through variable charges, and there's potential to move to more of a capacity charging basis. Finally, another red dotted box for something which isn't there. So DSO activities where a distribution system operator, DSO, may contract with users connected to its network to operate flexibly. So, for example, to increase or decrease demand or generation. Those kind of contracts aren't being considered as part of this work. A review of the distribution connection charging boundary. So just briefly touch on the status quo here again. We currently have what we call a shallowish connection boundary, where a new connectee is required to fund the cost of the assets to connect them to the wider network, and also a portion of the cost of work on the wider network which their connection drives. Ofgem is suggesting a move to a shallow connection boundary, where a new connectee would only fund the cost of the assets which connect them to the wider network. The cost of work on the wider network would be recovered through ongoing charges. So the current shallowish connection charges provide a strong locational signal for new connectees to connect where there is spare capacity. There's potential for the review of GEOS charges that we've just talked about to increase the locationality there, so to give that locational signal through ongoing usage charges rather than the connection charge. And then finally, a review of transmission network charges. This is a focused review, mainly on how generation connected to the distribution network is charged for its impact on the transmission network, and no consideration being given to changing the locational signals at transmission. So moving on from this slide then, just talking about the reasons why a significant code review could be launched. So Ofgem considers a significant code review and SCR to be appropriate where there's cross-code issues, so affecting more than just one code, so perhaps affecting both distribution and transmission, for example, where there's interactions with the price control, which, as I've just mentioned, the change to the connection boundary potentially has that price control impact with more revenue coming through ongoing usage charges and less through connection charges. And then contentious issues or issues with distributional impacts should be considered under a significant code review. Conversely, if there can be quick wins or changes build on existing responsibilities, then Ofgem considers they should be not under a significant code review and industry-led. So why are we talking about significant code reviews? Well, one of the biggest areas of this consultation is what should and shouldn't be within scope of a significant code review, and where Ofgem considers it has three options. So the first being a narrow significant code review, which would cover only the first four areas on this slide and would exclude access rights for larger users and allocation and reallocation. So those two would be progressed separately by industry-led projects. A moderate significant code review would bring large user access rights within the significant code review, but still leave allocation and reallocation outside. And then finally, a comprehensive significant code review would cover all six. So Ofgem is seeking views on whether to include the latter two under its significant code review, and I think we're about to seek your views on the same.
Thanks, Andrew. Yep. So second poll, and this is all with thinking in the context of what Andrew's just covered there. So effectively, what's the scope of Ofgem's proposed SCR? So just the options being narrow, so that was the first four items on Andrew's previous slide, and then moderate being the first five, and then comprehensive being all six, effectively. So Ofgem's seeking views on this, and as Andrew says, as are we. So I'm just about to kick off the second poll, which is there now.
Just put the previous slide back up as well as a reminder of
yes, good idea. So please let us know, and I can see people are doing so indeed. And just a reminder, please feel free to submit questions. I have seen some come in already, so we certainly have some areas to specifically focus on when we get to the end of this. I'll keep it open for a little bit longer. People give us views on what the scope of the SCR should be. It might be worth just quickly mention as well, in terms of the TCR, which is the only significant code review in force at the minute, Ofgem did the same, asked for views on what should be included and what shouldn't, and so some elements were excluded, specifically being storage. So there is precedence for a non-comprehensive SCR. Whether that's working well or not is another matter. So just give it another 10-15 seconds or so. Right, I shall end the poll then, see what the answers are. So we've got the majority favouring a moderate scope, so that would be excluding the allocation and reallocation of access rights to users. We have a few in favour of the narrow, and only one in favour of a comprehensive review where Ofgem would cover all. It's interesting to note, just because Ofgem's minded to position is very narrow or a moderate, which these responses broadly support.
Okay, thanks. Right, we're going to move on then, just for the last few minutes of this presentation before we move to the Q&A. So just going to talk through the key points that we intend to submit in our draft response. So starting from the kind of overall picture, we broadly agree that the review is needed, but as you can see on this slide, we disagree in some areas. You may have already guessed that by those little red boxes that appear on other slides of things that we think might be missing. Yeah, so just there's some more detail on this in the coming slides, so I won't dwell on that one. So Ofgem's primarily considering two charges, the connection charge and the ongoing usage charge. In our view, future network charges are likely to be consisting of three areas: of a connection charge, a usage charge, and the distribution system operator DSO contracting for flexibility. So, for example, with the DSO may contract with users to decrease usage of the network at peak times and thus avoid the need for costly reinforcement on the network. So in the consultations, Ofgem has identified some fairly big savings which can be achieved through flexibility. We consider those savings are unlikely to be achieved unless this third area of charging, this DSO contracting, is considered. And then finally, the transmission review, we consider this is a bit too narrow, in that one of the key aims of the work is to align arrangements of distribution and transmission, with transmission being left largely as is. This only really leaves one option, being to align distribution to existing transmission arrangements. Those existing transmission arrangements may work well for a small number of particularly big users, as the transmission network has. They're very large users connected to the transmission network, and a small number of them. We're concerned as to whether those arrangements will also work well for effectively the opposite of that, a very large number of relatively small users connected to the distribution network. And we also need to consider the structural and engineering differences between the two networks, with the transmission network having the majority of customers connected at a single voltage, the distribution networks being radial in nature have users connected at all voltages throughout. In terms of access arrangements, so again, we agree that the review needs to happen. We're a bit concerned about asking small users to define what access they require being impractical. We have, on our network alone, we have nearly 4 million connectees, and that obviously extends to many more than that GB wide. We also don't agree with this suggestion of a core level of demand, on the basis that it essentially relies on a third party determining what usage for a user is essential and what isn't. We consider different users will have different ideas of what is and isn't essential, and also demand which is considered essential now may no longer be, demand which is considered non-essential now may well be considered essential in the not too distant future. Thinking about electric vehicles, for example, at the moment we may consider them non-essential, but in who knows, 10 years' time, we may be saying an electric vehicle is essential to get to work. In terms of larger users then, so again, we agree a review is needed. We think particularly the area of firmness is an interesting one to review, and time profiling, where off-peak access could, for example, allow existing network capacity to be used more fully, where potentially two generators, for example, could effectively share the same capacity by agreeing to use it at different times. And then the final point on this slide, we need there needs to be some consequence of not complying with access agreements if more choice is available. If network companies are to be able to plan their networks based on these access agreements, then there needs to be a good deal of confidence that users are going to operate within them. So there needs to be consequences of not doing so. Finally, on the process point, so the question we just asked you, in our view, we consider that the comprehensive significant code review is the most appropriate, primarily because of the point about changes being contentious and creating distributional impacts. We consider that almost all of the changes being considered here potentially have those distributional impacts, and so need Ofgem leadership to give proper legitimacy to the outcomes that are reached. And the final point that we would make is that any changes we are going to implement, we need to be sure that they deliver the benefits that we think they're going to, potentially through trials, for example, before a mass rollout is undertaken. So a final slide on the next steps. So the consultation is open, closes in just over a fortnight. So I'm sure Ofgem is keen to get as many responses as possible there. And then later in the year, it's planned by the end of this year that Ofgem will launch a significant code review, assuming it decides to do so. And then throughout 2019 and 2020, options will be developed and assessed. First step changes potentially implemented from April 2021, and the remaining changes implemented by April 2023. So as Lee mentioned, I think we are going to ask that poll question about whether we've improved understanding later on, but we'll just go through Q&A first to see if we can clear up anything that's not yet clear. So.
Yeah, so we've got some questions come in. Please do keep sending them in as we go, and as I say, if we don't get to responding to them here, then we will be emailing out afterwards, and likewise, feel free to email us, and we will answer questions that way. So the first question, we said we weren't going to touch on it directly, but the question's been asked, and it's a very valid point, to be fair. So the question from a panel is, how does this consultation interact with the targeted charging review? If I can just skip back, get control of the slides, and go back to one slide in particular. Not that one. There we are. That's got a few on the screen there. So, Andrew, I'll ask you that question, and it's this component, the second component we mentioned of the use of system charges. So how does the targeted charge review interact with this review of forward-looking access charges?
Okay. I think to a certain extent there are two answers to that question. As Lee talked through on this slide, Ofgem sees a very clear split between so that's a yellow box with forward-looking charges and the grey box with the residual component. So Ofgem sees that forward-looking charges are about giving cost signals to users about how behavioural changes will impact long-run network costs, and then the residual element is about ensuring that network companies can recover their allowed revenues. So Ofgem sees a very clear distinction between the two, and sees that this work is focusing on, so this work being the access and forward-looking charges work, is focusing on the forward-looking elements only. The targeted charging review is looking at the residual elements only. So Ofgem considers that wherever this forward-looking charges work lands, there will still be some residual elements which the targeted charging review is looking at how can be most equitably recovered from customers without distorting the cost signals that are created from this work. I think the second answer to the question is that actually, in reality, the two are perhaps slightly more closely linked than that, and particularly from an end user perspective. And I think Ofgem is hearing concerns that really, from an end user perspective, the combined impact is what is of interest, and it doesn't make all that much sense to assess one without the other. So I think that the interactions, hopefully in time, will be seen through some comprehensive impact analysis. But at the moment, the two are being viewed as separate things.
Yeah, I know we both attended some of Ofgem's workshops, and certainly the views from those in the room, as you say, have just been, you echoed the point there that they wished for the impact analysis to be done together to get the whole view, but Ofgem reiterated their points several times that they didn't wish to hold up the benefits that could be brought from the targeted charging review by waiting for this to be progressed further. Obviously, as Andrew's just mentioned on the slides there, you're looking out to 2021, potentially before some of this reform implemented, where the targeted charging review, they're looking certainly for charges to be impacted from April 2020, which we think in the distribution world is us setting charges this December. So there's some challenges there. So yeah, as Andrew's mentioned there, the two are inevitably linked, as in the outcome of this reform. I think in terms of cost-reflective charges, where cost-reflective charges, as Ofgem define them, are really to do with the signal that Ofgem, these charges provide to give an incentive for distribution and, well, for network companies to not, or to defer reinforcement. That very much has an impact on what the size of the residual is, because cost reflectivity in that sense is not reflecting the costs which users impose on the network right now. And whilst that is the case, there's going to be left with this top-up element, effectively. We've certainly argued for a need for charges to be more cost reflective, such that this residual element is smaller. But at the end of the day, how that residual element is treated is relevant, whether it's 50% of distribution charges as it is now, or 5%. And that 50% is equivalent to around 80% of transmission. Hence why Ofgem, and forecast to grow, hence why Ofgem want this dealt with sooner rather than waiting for this consultation to bear fruit. I hope that's answered some of the question. And then, like I say, if you wish to discuss the target charge review with us, please get in touch and we can come to some kind of arrangements. Next question now. So, Andrew, a question from Stephen. Do you expect the growth in EV charging to further change the role of DSOs via the TSO? Do you have projections?
Okay, that's a good question. And there's actually another very interesting consultation out at the moment from the Open Networks project, which Lee mentioned, called the Future Worlds Consultation. Yes. Which is looking at not specifically for electric vehicles, but that subject precisely of the interactions between the distribution system operator and the transmission system operator. I think the very short answer to the question is yes. We see huge opportunities from electric vehicles, simply because we would have with a fleet of electric vehicles, we have an enormous amount of flexible demand and potentially dispatchable generation in the form of fully charged at batteries on people's drives or at people's places of work, where they can be called at times of network stress. So I think perhaps not answering the question directly in terms of the role between DSOs and TSOs, but certainly in terms of the flexibility that will be connected and the opportunities that brings, we certainly see changes in roles in terms of how that work is divided up between the DSO and the TSO. That Future Worlds consultation is really where that debate is ongoing, yeah, we're again more than happy to pick up on that separately. If we make sure we've got the experts on that consultation in the room as well, if you'd like to discuss that one further. Which
that might be wrong. I think it was due for submission today.
Not quite. I think
not quite.
I hope not.
Oh, it's further out. Sorry.
Yeah, I hope it's not due today because we haven't submitted that yet. But
it's mixed up. But yeah,
it's on a similar timescale. That consultation's on a similar timescale to this one, isn't it?
20-somethings, isn't it? I'm getting confused. Right. If there's anything else, we're going to deal with it, emailing people directly. I'm just trying to we get to the right slide. Have you got control of that, Andrew? Right, trying to bring that up. So we're going to kick off the final poll. As I said earlier, this is asking the same question as we did earlier. So we're hoping what's been covered primarily by. We have another question. That's just came in for to be answered before I got the poll. Apologies for that. So from Stephen again. Is there a risk inherent to Ofgem's approach that they make changes without anticipating allowing for future scenarios?
So I think there is an aim of this work to future-proof the arrangements to a certain extent. So although we have spoken a lot about electric vehicles, we are as I mentioned, one of the desirable features is creating a level playing field, that these arrangements are kind of technology neutral. So I think we use electric vehicles as an example, but really general demand growth and general generation growth and charging cost reflectively should create enduring arrangements that allow for a broad range of future scenarios. So we're not building arrangements that are specifically designed to deal with the rollout of electric vehicles, but we are designing arrangements that are capable of dealing with increases in demand and generation connected to distribution networks and how they interact, and charging cost reflectively, so users are incentivized to reduce or increase network usage at times when it would be economically efficient to do so.
Okay. Another question has cropped in. So from Ryan, are Ofgem considering transitional arrangements for implementation?
Okay, that's another interesting question. I think that this is obviously of real interest to a lot of end users, particularly for example, for large demand users, where some of the changes to access rights may be causing some concern. I think it's very difficult to say at the moment what those transitional arrangements need to be until we have an idea of what the future world looks like. But I think Ofgem is certainly aware that some of these changes it's considering are pretty fundamental and may likely have a need for transitional arrangements to enable a smooth transition from one to the other without causing big shocks to businesses and residential users alike.
It's certainly something they're considering as part of the targeted charging review. So yes, I think the answer is it will be considered in terms of transition arrangements. Might mean a difference between distribution and transmission, might mean a difference between how various user groups are affected, but it remains quite up in the air at the minute. But ultimately, I think if it's warranted, it will be considered, and hence why we need people's views. Definitely. So I'll go back to the poll, and as I say, asking the same question we did earlier. We hope the information has been useful. So I'll ask the question again. What is your level of understanding of Ofgem's work on access and forward-looking charges? So is it I don't understand it at all? Is it limited understanding? Is it reasonable working understanding? Or is it I'm an expert? So I'm going to set that live now. And I can see the answers come in. If I remember rightly, we had one on not understand at all, the majority on limited understanding. No experts, so I'd be very impressed if we've created any experts. Please come and talk to us if you're an expert. Give it another 10-15 seconds for some submissions. And before. Okay, I shall end it there. Thank you. So, thankfully we have none on I don't understand at all, so well done, Andrew. And the majority now on reasonable working understanding, which I think is exactly the right direction we want to go. And I'm not at all surprised that we don't have any people present to be an expert on this, given how complicated and broad the whole consultation is. So that's great. Thank you very much for that. So we've got 63% on reasonable working understanding and just under 38% on limited understanding. That's brilliant. Thank you. So, in terms of kind of the next steps on how to engage with us, how we can engage with you. So the consultation response deadline, as it's been mentioned, is the 18th of September. If you would like to come and talk to us directly on it, or would like us to come and speak to you, then please drop a note to Andrew or myself, or to the Use of System Charges mailbox. There is going to be a stakeholder summit which we're holding in York on December the 5th, later this year. I would watch out for social media personally if you want more information on that, or please get in touch and we can share information once we know more on that. But certainly will be an excellent opportunity for you guys to engage further. Just go to the next slide. So all we're looking to give you here is effectively a link to some of the material. I mentioned before the Charging Futures website. Highly recommend you look through that in terms of listening to the podcasts and the webinars. You've got some views of Andy Burgess from Ofgem on there. You've got different views from different types of customer, from generators through views of residential customers. So please do take a look. It's very useful information. That's everything from me. Andrew, anything else from you before we close?
That's all.
Great stuff. Well, thank you very much for taking your dinner on this first Monday of the first full working week, since we had a short week last week after the bank holiday. Much appreciated, and if you've got any questions, please do get in touch. I shall close the webinar here 8 minutes ahead of schedule. Thanks everyone. Bye now.